All right, this is lesson 8, part B. We cleaned the fish on a plank table outdoors. I didn't care much for it. It made me kind of sick to hear Grandma rip the skin off the catfish. She had her own quick way of doing that, but every time it sounded like the fish screamed. She put me in charge of chopping off their heads, but I didn't like chopping off the head of anything looking back at me. And catfish have mustaches for some reason, which is just plain weird. Finally Mary Alice took the rusty hatchet out of my hand, and whoop! She'd bring down the blade and that fish head would go flying. Mary Alice was good at it, so I let her do it. Grandma gutted. It was afternoon before we sat down at the dining room table under a cobwebby gaselier. Aunt Puss was already at her place, so she was sprier than she looked. Grandma settled at the foot of the table. Without her hat, her white hair hung in damp tendrils. We'd been working like a whole pack of bird dogs. Watching Aunt Puss gum catfish was not a pretty sight. "These catfish taste muddy," she observed. "Yuns catch 'em?" "Yes," I said. "No," Mary Alice said. "What did you use for bait?" Aunt Puss said, looking at both of us. "Cheese," I said. "Worms," Mary Alice said more wisely. Since we couldn't get together on our story, Aunt Puss changed the subject. "You chillin' still at school?" We nodded. "Do they whoop ya?" "Do they what?" Mary Alice asked. "Do they paddle your behind when you need it?" Aunt Puss looked interested. "If they did, I'd quit school," said Mary Alice, who'd just completed third grade. "They whooped that girl raw." Aunt Puss pointed her fork down at the table at Grandma. I had a sudden thought. Aunt Puss thought Grandma and Mary Alice and I were all about the same age. She hadn't noticed the years passing. That's why Grandma didn't say we were her grandkids. It would just have mixed up Aunt Puss. "That's when she came to work for me. They throwed her out of school." Aunt Puss peered down the table. "Tell 'em why." We looked at Grandma, naturally interested to know why she'd been thrown out of school. Grandma waved us away. "I forget," she said. "I don't." Aunt Puss waved a fork. "It was because you wadded up your underdrawers to stop up the flue on the stove and smoke out the schoolhouse. That was the end of your education." "Working for you was an education," Grandma muttered, though only Mary Alice and I heard. It took us another hour to clean up the kitchen the way Grandma wanted to leave it. When it was time for us to go, Aunt Puss was back in her chair in the parlor. "Where do you think you're off to now?" she called out as we trooped through the front door. "Down to the sty to slop the hogs," Grandma called back. "Well, don't dawdle. You dawdle, and I've spoken to you about that before. Get on out of here," Aunt Puss hollered. "Let the door hit you where the dog bit you." "Outdoors," I said. "Does she have hogs?" "She used to," Grandma said. "She was right well off at one time. She's poor now, but she don't know it." "How could she?" How still had there She still had her hired girl and plenty to eat. "You take her food every week, don't you, Grandma?" "Generally a good big roast chicken. She can gum that for days." Grandma turned down the lane. "It keeps her out of the poor farm, and it gives me a quiet day in the country. That's a fair swap." Then her jaw clenched in its way. "But it's just private business between her and me, and I don't tell my private business." We walked country roads all the way home. Grandma set a brisk pace, and I struggled along behind with a hamper heavy with cleaned catfish. Mary Alice went in the middle, watching where she walked. By the time we got home, the trees in Grandma's yard were throwing long shadows, and it was evening in her kitchen. Mary Alice and I were both staggering. I was ready to go straight up to bed. But Grandma said, "Skin down to the cellar and bring up 15 or 20 bottles of my beer. Just carry 2 at a time. I don't want any broke." I whimpered, but she was turning on Mary Alice. "And you and me's going to fry up a couple of pecks of potatoes to go with the fish. There won't be nothing to it. I peeled the potatoes this morning before you two was up." We stared. The catfish fried in long pans with the potatoes and onions at the other end popping in the grease. The kitchen was blue with smoke, and night was at the windows before we finished up. "Now get down every platter I own," she told me. Then she sent me for the card table I'd used for my jigsaw puzzle of Charles A. Lindbergh. Following her lead, we carried everything out into the night, making many trips. We lugged it all across the road and up to the Wabash Railroad right-of-way and planted the card table in the gravel. Finally, the platters of fish and potatoes overlapped on the table, and the opened beer bottle stood in a row beside the tracks. As the drifters came along, being hounded out of town, Grandma gave them a good feed and a bear to wet their whistles. Mary Alice helped in an apron of Grandma's that dragged the ground. They were hollow-eyed men who couldn't believe their luck. 2 or 3 of them, then 5 or 6, then a bunch, standing around the table, eating with both hands, sharing out the bear. They didn't say much. They didn't thank her. She wasn't looking for thanks. She'd taken off her overalls and put the same wash dress back on, but she tied a fresh apron over it. Her hair was a mess, fanning out from the bun at the back, white in the moonlight. She watched them feed, working her mouth. Then we saw the swinging lanterns, the sheriff and his deputies coming along behind to keep the drifters moving. Up trooped O.B. Dickerson, dressed now with his badge on and his belt full of bullets, riding low under his belly. His deputies loomed behind him, but they weren't singing Sweet Adeline. "Okay, okay, break it up," he said, elbowing through the drifters. Then he came to Grandma. "Dagnammit, Mrs. Dowdle, you're everywhere I turn. You're all over me like white on rice. Now what do you think you're doing?" "I'm giving these boys the first eats they've had today." "Or yesterday," a drifter said. "Mrs. Dowdle, let me splain something to you," the sheriff bawled. "We don't want to feed these loafers. We want 'em out of town." "They're out of town." Grandma pointed her spatula at the sheriff's feet. "The town stops there. We're in the country." "Yes, and I'm the sheriff of the country," O.B. Dickerson bellowed. "You're in my jurisdiction." "Do tell," Grandma said. "Run me in." The minute she said that, all the drifters looked up. That was when Sheriff Dickerson's deputies saw they were outnumbered. "Mrs. Dowdle," the sheriff boomed, "I wouldn't know what to charge you with first. You're a one-woman crime wave. Where'd you get them fish, for instance?" he said, wisely overlooking the home brews in the drifters' hands. "Out of a trap at Salt Crick," Grandma remarked, "same as you get yours." O.B. Dickerson's eyes bulged. "You 'cusing the sheriff of Piatt County of running fish traps?" Uh, sorry. "Of running fish traps?" He poked his own chest with a pudgy finger. "Not this morning," Grandma replied. "You was too drunk." The drifters chuckled. "And talking about this morning," the sheriff said, his face shading purple even in the darkness, "you stole my boat. That's what we call larceny, Mrs. Dowdle. You could go up for that." "Oh, well, the boat." Grandma made a little gesture with her spatula. "You'll find it tied up at Aunt Puss Chapman's dock. As a rule I take it back where you tie it up. But of course I couldn't do that this morning. How could I row these grandkids of mine back past the Rod and Gun Club? They'd already seen what no child should. The sheriff and his deputies, blind, drunk, and naked as jaybirds, dancing jigs on the porch, and I don't know what all. It's like to have marked the girl for life." Grandma nudged Mary Alice, who stood there in the big apron looking drooped and damaged. "I'm thinking about taking her to the doctor so she can talk it out. I don't want her to develop one of them complexes you hear about." "Whoa," the deputies murmured behind Sheriff Dickerson. Errol T. Askew stepped up and said into his ear, "Obie, let's just let sleeping dogs lay. I got my hands full with Mrs. Askew as it is." The sheriff simmered, but said, "Okay, Earl, if you say so." The sheriff and his posse were in retreat now, but he had to cover himself. "Mrs. Dowdle," he said, pulling a long face, "they's things I can overlook, but it seems to me you're running a soup kitchen without a license from the Board of Health. I have an idea there's a law against that on the books." "Go look it up, O.B.," Grandma said. "See if there's a law against feeding the hungry. But I have to tell you, you've talked so long, the evidence is all laid up." And of course it was. The drifters had wolfed down the last morsel. With a small finger Mary Alice pointed out the bare platters. Only a faint scent of fried catfish lingered on the night air. The empty beer bottles went without saying. The drifters were moving off down the track, and the deputies were heading back into town. O.B. Dickerson spit in the gravel, swung around, and followed them, his big boots grinding gravel. We stacked the platters and rounded up the beer bottles for Grandma's next batch. I collapsed the legs on the card table. There wasn't a lot of music in Grandma, but she was humming as we worked, and I thought I recognized the tune. "The night that Patty Murphy died, I never shall forget." Then, after a quiet day in the country, I don't think it was very quiet, we carried everything back across the road under a silver dollar moon. All right. We can see what kind of person Grandma is from that point, too. She's feeding all the people who couldn't find work. And she went through a lot of work to get be able to do that. All right, don't forget to answer the question that's attached to this assignment.